Our next presenter, I'm really happy to have Sam Butcher back to Canada. His fascination by science and passion for teaching led him to Labster. His work with universities and colleges across Europe and North America to revolutionize the way we teach science through innovative approaches to implementing virtual laboratory simulations. This presentation today will cover recent advances in the application of VR in science education and the future direction of VR in teaching and learning. Please join me in welcoming Sam back to Canada.
I'm sorry for those of you expecting Michael Boudicca. Unfortunately, he became quite unwell, so I've jumped on board to take his place for this presentation. So please do bear with me. I'm a little bit jet-lagged and unprepared, but I have prepared everything that I can do on our work with VR in science education, and I just want to talk through what we've learnt, what we're developing, and where we think VR science education is going. So before I begin, I wanted to tell you all a story. Now, this is the story of my science education, so I'm sorry to start off on such a boring note, but I, in primary school, cannot remember a single one of my science lessons. I just can't. But I can remember, as if it was yesterday, the first science practical that I ever had, even down to the little tea light that we were using instead of a Bunsen burner. It really was quite rudimentary in a rural school in the middle of Yorkshire. But it was wonderful, and it's not to say that I didn't have amazing moments of discovery in my science lessons, but it was that lab practical, it was that experimental process, that experiential science learning experience that really made me fall in love with science. And from that point, I decided that I was going to learn science whenever possible. So I ended up learning science all the way through my high school years. And during those years, I came across a wonderful Canadian-American TV show. Now, does anyone recognize this show? Could I get a raise of hands? There we go. So I love this show. People don't really know it that well in Europe, but I fell in love with this idea of going on a magic school bus so that you could go into outer space or flow through the digestive system and learn as if you were actually there at a cellular or a molecular level, what is actually happening, how these processes work, and having that kind of aha moment of understanding what was going on. That was the thing that I loved. So I loved science at high school. It really was when I was in my element. The challenge that I had, however, was when I got to university. You see, I'd gone through years and years of studying biology, chemistry, physics, taking in science everywhere that I could. And I finally got to university up at Newcastle, and I started out on a medicinal chemistry course. After a couple of days, I realized it wasn't for me, and I begged and pleaded in the medical school to let me onto their pharmacology program. And they let me on. I was incredibly happy. But then, a couple of weeks in, I found myself in a bit of a weird and frustrating situation because I was there at university studying a course because I just simply loved the subject matter. But I still ended up being this guy right here, the guy fast asleep at the back of the room. It's not to say that I started out at the back, I actually started at the front, but because I kept doing that embarrassing thing where you catch your head as you fall asleep and jerk back up, I ended up moving further and further backwards because I was embarrassed and fewer people would laugh at me the further back I was. So I couldn't figure out what it was, and it only really later dawned on me that it was just because I wasn't suited to this type of environment. I really wasn't a good student for learning in a lecture setting using what are often described as more passive methods of teaching. Instead, I was in my element when I was in a lab, when I was experimenting, having that experiential learning experience with my classmates, getting into the lab, playing around with different chemicals, learning from trial and error, from making mistakes, and actually seeing the result of those experiments, seeing that real world outcome of the work that I was doing. So it's safe to say that when I finished my university education, and I came across this, I was so inspired.
Absolutely amazing.
So, this guy right here is talking about a VR educational experience that demonstrates what it's like to go into outer space. And I'm going to shut up for a moment and let you just watch this, because I think it's so powerful to hear what this guy has to say about this VR experience. I really want you to just think about the emotions that he's expressing here.
Like, this was just incredible. It makes me so happy that my rift right here can make me feel such powerful emotions from something that wasn't even real. And I haven't experienced something quite like that. I just got a lot of emotions going through me right now. So, because of just how amazingly detailed and just how awesome that was. Can you imagine, like, if you were back in high school and you were in your science class and you started talking about the Apollo missions, and instead of going through a long lecture about it, they gave you a VR headset and put you in this? How much more is that able to teach you than just someone sitting up there talking about it? Not that it's a bad thing, but this is just so much more powerful. I felt like I was in that space shuttle with Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins. That was... I'm not crying, but I certainly feel like I want to.
Isn't that amazing? You know, when I first saw that, I thought, that's the magic school bus of the future. You know, that's the way that we're going. This is the way that we should be teaching. So when I had an opportunity to join Labster, I jumped at it because I came across a company that started out as an outreach project, trying to get more kids excited by science education. This little company in Copenhagen with about 20 employees that was just building virtual lab simulations for computer browsers. At the time, they were kind of exploring VR, but really the main work that they were doing was on these computer game-style web-based simulations of science experiments. So I wanted to just show you how Labster started off and what we've been working on for the last 5 years. So these are our web-based virtual labs. And as you can see, they've got a computer game-style interface. They contain all of the kind of equipment that you would find in a real lab. And you would do everything that you would be required to do in a real lab environment. If required, you'll put on gloves, a lab coat, goggles, and then you will play through, for each one of these labs, an experimental procedure from start to finish. We build in a storyline, all of the laboratory work, and then 3D, often interactive animations at a cellular or a molecular level. So what we wanted to do was take a lot of the gamification learning theory that was out there and apply it to science education to see if we could make an all-encompassing science education computer game that could be used by students at home in their own time using simulated versions of equipment that you would find in a real lab. So we didn't create completely open-ended investigative labs, but instead focused on undergraduate education where building that structure into an experimental environment would keep students engaged and keep them playing through learning outcomes while picking up an understanding of the lab techniques and the protocols that they would play through and that they would use in a real lab. So it wasn't designed to replace a real lab, but instead to enhance it so a student could complete a virtual lab, for example, before getting into a real lab setting. And I was inspired by this approach because it wasn't a particularly sort of capitalist perspective of trying to make a lot of money by replacing expensive real labs with virtual ones, but instead was just designed to keep students engaged and excited by science education and really doing all of this with the aim of making science education more beneficial and more accessible. And it was successful. We were published in Nature Biotechnology with increases in learning outcomes of 76% compared to traditional teaching. In a blended approach, 101%, with 100% retention of information after 40 days, which was powerful. It was really incredible stuff. And on top of that, the students loved it. What we were seeing was students liked the labs, they enjoyed the simulations. When they were built correctly into a course, they really saw the benefit, and it made their courses more enjoyable. In addition to that, for typically students that would struggle more, they benefited quite a lot from this approach. So you can see here, for low knowledge, the poorer performing students, they had a very significant increase in learning outcomes, motivation, and self-efficacy. So this is really promising work, but really, that wasn't the main reason why I joined Labster. The main reason was because one time when I was in London, one of the guys from Labster was over there, and he had a VR headset with him. And it was a VR headset containing a virtual lab simulation that allowed you to go inside a PCR machine, a piece of kit that amplifies a small sample of DNA. So we were in the back of a London taxi, and he puts this VR headset on me, and I get myself shrunk down to a molecular level where I can see in this completely immersive view a DNA replication reaction. And once again, I thought, this is the future Magic School Bus. This is fantastic. This is what I want to do. So I jumped on board. And since then, we've really pushed and pushed to advance the work that we're doing in VR. We've taken a couple of these prototypes and expanded them further. We've applied for grant funding to build in new technologies to make these labs more effective. And the main reason for doing this is just simply because science education is just often found to be boring. Students say that science education is boring. They don't say that science is boring, just the way that we typically tend to teach it, especially at a university level. I'm not saying that everyone does it, but there is that common perception, and that indicates that there's something that we really should think about doing to change the way that we teach. So we started experimenting a little bit more with VR, and we partnered with Google, with their Daydream team, to create a new prototype lab, which you can see here, which has this little drone that follows you around and offers you support, allows you to go into a laboratory environment and learn by making mistakes, learn safety protocols that you would learn in a real lab. And it's a short demonstration, about 10, 15 minutes long, designed for really high school students, again, just to teach them some basic lab safety skills. And this is a great next step, but there's still more that we need to do. So we've taken this a little bit further, and we've started exploring a few new avenues. We've started working with some researchers, in particular a group of psychologists at the University of Southern Denmark, who have expertise in learning theory and in the use of educational resources. And I wanted to show you some of their preliminary results, which aren't published yet, so you're getting a little bit of a sneak preview as to some of the insights that they've found from using these virtual lab simulations, and to look at some of their recommendations for how to apply this platform to science teaching. So this is at the University of Southern Denmark in their psychology department, where they were able to purchase some EEG kit to use to compare how students performed when using a virtual reality lab compared to a standard web-based version of one of our labs. Now, what it was found through this research was that in the VR labs, cognitive load increased, but learning didn't. Learning in some instances actually decreased a little bit compared to the web-based lab. So it suggests from this that just simple immersion using VR is not enough to gain educational benefit. We need to do more than just apply it to a new platform in order to get the kind of results that we expect from VR. Instead, we need to learn how to design for VR to make the most out of the platform that we have. We can't just take one format and then stick it onto another and just assume that it's going to be okay. We can't, for example, just make a virtual reality classroom and sit people down in it and give them a virtual reality lecture. That isn't going to benefit anyone. Instead, what we want to do at Labster is create something that looks a little bit like a science theme park. We want to create that magic school bus experience for kids so that they can do their lab work and they can practice it if they want to or if they need to. But interspersed within that, we want them to flow through a blood vessel. We want them to fight a germ. We want them to take the place of a red blood cell. We want them to go into outer space, to do the things that they couldn't do in a real world educational setting. And we think that this is where we will start to see the real benefits come from the use of VR in science education. And Guido Marikansky, who's one of the lead researchers on this work, said it himself here. And I just wanted to leave those words up there for a moment because it really resonates with me. This is the way that we all should be thinking about VR when we are thinking about how to build it into our curriculum. Don't just digitize, don't just build a VR version, but instead think about what VR enables you to do, empowers you to do as an academic or a student, and make the most of it. Now, beyond Labster, we're a small company. We're 5 years old with 70 employees, and we do all of our development and our writing work in-house with some collaborations with universities to create the content. And this just isn't scalable to the kind of degree that we want it to be. So we wanted to look at another way of using virtual labs and using virtual reality in teaching. And we wanted to empower academics and students to create their own resources using our expertise, our platform, our knowledge. And in part, this was inspired by some work that we did with Exeter University down in Cornwall in the UK, where instead of collaborating with academics to build one of our labs, we instead collaborated with a group of students who went out on their own and figured out what they needed to do to create an effective lab simulation. So there's a video that they created that's about 15 minutes long that talks through their process. They actually did it without our knowledge and then showed us it afterwards. But it's just such a great video that I put together a few snippets so you can see what kind of experience the students had by creating a virtual lab environment. So let's see if this will work. Here we are.
Once we had accepted the mission, we immediately met with our supervisor Sam to brainstorm the project, what we wanted to accomplish and how we would need to go about this. We scheduled weekly group meetings with him and organised a rota for a chair and note taker for each meeting.
Yeah. We wanted the user to feel as if they were using the confocal microscope and its software, changing the settings to obtain images just as you would in the real thing, so they would feel that they are contributing to solving the problem of the failing crop. The user would diagnose the infection and discover the extent of attack through the leaf layers using the confocal microscope. For this, we needed to acquire our own images of the barley leaf infected with powdery mildew.
The next step was to meet our Labster correspondent, Sarah, to discuss logistics of the project, including deadlines and what exactly they needed from us. Since Sarah is based in Switzerland, our meetings with her were done over Skype.
Mike gave us a fresh barley plant from the growth room, from which we cut samples and brushed with fungal spores. We incubated these for 2 days for the infection to take hold and stained the sample with calcifluor white, a fluorescent dye that binds to the chitin in the cell wall. Through staining, we could see the fungus's primary and secondary infection mechanism clearly under the confocal microscope. These are the images we took and some of the 3D Z stacks that will be used in the simulation.
So what do you think your students would think of Labster?
I described Labster to one of my students, who actually is a student who doesn't like science very much, but she was saying how cool it sounded to be able to do really dangerous experiments in actual big, expensive labs.
Getting it done. I mean, you set your sights very, very high. You have something that at the end of it, you have a thing that you've made, that you've built, that will be used by potentially thousands of people.
From first impressions, did you actually think we'd do it?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, I did.
You enjoyed working with the Labster group?
No, it's been awful. No, it's been great. I've really, really enjoyed it. I'm very, very proud of my students.
We really enjoyed working on this project.
We learnt a lot about the confocal microscope and gained invaluable experience of a real-life research environment.
This project helped us to improve our teamwork,
Professionalism,
Time management, lab techniques,
communication, and we had a lot of fun.
We look forward to seeing our finished simulation and hope that it helps other students to learn more about confocal microscopy.
So the reason why I wanted to show you that was, one, because it's just really cool, but secondly, because very few students will have an opportunity to create something like this, but we wanted to allow more students and academics to do the same thing. So we created something that would allow students to create a lab like this, which is the Exeter Lab, without having to work with us on a long, drawn-out, extensive project, and instead could just use a simple user interface to create their own simulations. Now, this is quite general because it's a cross-platform project that we're working on. But the exciting and very cool part of this is that we are creating it for virtual reality headsets as well, so that students can use this user interface here, that we don't have a name for yet, but we'll probably call something like Lab Builder, that will allow students to put on a headset and drag and drop pieces of equipment into a virtual laboratory environment and build their own simulations using guidance from us, and really have the same experience that the guys at Exeter had, just in a more simple and accessible way. So this is what Lab Builder looks like at the moment. Let's see if this will play. Maybe not. Not to worry. There we are. So as you see, you can build your own simulations by dragging and dropping pieces of equipment in and then building this simulation around that. Now, the real reason why we wanted to do this from a sort of big picture company perspective, beyond just allowing students to have the opportunity to create their own simulations, was to rapidly scale up the amount of content that is available on this platform so that we can, down the line, create this free open source platform where anyone can create their own lab simulation. And then for ourselves at Labster, our role will become to curate this content, to create packages, to rate them, to make sure that academics have the right content so that, for example, a professor at MIT can create a lab that can then be used by 1,000 students in the heart of Africa, for example, and to really get to that early goal that I mentioned, which is to make science education not just more effective, but also more accessible. And on that note, I think it's just worth mentioning for everyone who's working within VR content development that sometimes VR is not enough. Accessibility is important, and not everyone can use VR and make the most of those environments. So wherever possible, I really would encourage everyone to create cross-platform content that can be used on a web browser, that can be used on a tablet or a smartphone and a VR headset as well, so that you aren't restricting certain students from accessing some of these fascinating and exciting resources. And finally, onto the future. I just wanted to briefly mention one of our big projects that we're working on called CIPROS. Now, this is a collaborative project with a $5 million budget. We're working with MIT, Stanford, University of Copenhagen, and Biogen to create new versions of these virtual reality labs that incorporate haptic glove technology. Now, the goal of this project is to create labs that will allow students to physically interact with virtual objects within the virtual environment and then to assess them in real time using the data that's coming from those haptic gloves. So we're about a half a year in. It's got 4.5 years to go. So watch this space. The first studies that are coming from this should be published within the next 2 to 3 months. But VR is happening much more quickly than a lot of people think. VR education will be here before you know it, so watch this space. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is all really neat. So, is this directed mainly at biology, sort of chemistry type experiments, or is there physics built in for doing more like physical experiments?
At the moment, the majority of these labs are biology focused, primarily because most of us are biologists. Our founder is a biotechnologist. We've got biochemists. I'm a pharmacologist. But we are creating chemistry labs too. And we have just hired a PhD-educated physicist who is joining our writing staff. So we're starting to create our first physics and engineering labs, which will be ready soon. So we've got a very clear roadmap. It's it's biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, and then we'll expand from there.
Thanks, Sam. You know, the last piece of what you were showing us about the lab builder, I think gets to a question that seems to emerge of a number of discussions that we've had over the breaks and lunch about feasibility, right? We've seen so much neat technology today, but we've also been aware of the amount of energies devoted to developing this technology, right? In terms of monies, time, to have teams build this environment so that the students can become immersed, or the instructors, the amount of planning. We've had research presentations about some of the lessons learned there. If let's say a professor gets funding for this, devotes a period of time with their students to develop something, and let's say that takes a year and they're going to use it, I think of that, and then in another space I think of all the other messages I've heard today about how technology is evolving so quickly, and that this is here today, but tomorrow it's going to be so different. It's going to be augmented this, and it's going to be something that. You know, if I invest one whole year and $100,000 in this, how do I keep up with this evolving technology, and how do I decide what I want to invest myself in as an instructor that's worthwhile for my students and for my own use of time? What are your thoughts about that?
That's a really tricky one. It's going to vary so much from person to person, and it raises some interesting questions for us at Labster. Our focus so far has been to create simulations that are platform agnostic from birth. So every time we create one of these labs, they can be used across all of these different platforms. And as new technologies emerge, we need to ensure that that continues to be the case. So we need to figure out ourselves how we can ensure that there is longevity to these teaching resources. But when it costs us X amount of money to create one lab and X number of hours, it does become restrictive. We've created 60 labs in, well, 5 years. What we want to do is allow an instructor, an academic, or a student to create a lab in a period of, let's say, a couple of days for something very simple, to 1 week, maybe a month for something more advanced. And we think that we can do that with this user interface, with a little bit of training. So we don't believe we will get to the point where there will be this very large monetary and time investment that could potentially become wasted. But it's still very early days with this platform. We haven't even tested it with university partners yet. That's going to happen early 2018. So a lot of these questions, even for us, are still unanswered, and all I can do is speculate at this point in time.
This one should be fast. It's just a follow-up to the last one. So can the content be created in a way that could be used in other platforms? So like, you know, object files, maybe some XML for your text, stuff like that? Or is everything in a proprietary format?
We think there's going to be a little bit of a mix of both. When it comes to adding objects and assets, we would like for people to be able to do so, but it may become tricky with the early versions. So instead, we will have a very large set, over 1,000 different pieces of equipment that you can add in. But then, of course, we will need people to be able to create their own versions and add those in. So that is likely to be added in later versions, but we will, for the earlier versions, at least allow you to add in video, text, animations, some of these text and theory components that we really need to have in from the very start. Oh.
Hi. One of the biggest challenges I've had over the years is getting students to actually do the manipulations reproducibly. Pipetting, for example, to get the right volumes out so that you can get results that are quantitative and reproducible. Streaking of plates. I noticed you sort of had things there, but that experience of actually the fine motor movements are the things that are going to be the educational aspects that would help me as a person who's going to have people like this working in my lab.
Yes, it's a really interesting point. For us, we acknowledge that these web-based and these early VR labs aren't going to allow students to physically manipulate these objects and to have that kinesthetic learning element in the learning experience. That will come later with the haptic gloves, if of course this project is successful. But until then, these labs are never going to replace a real lab. Instead, we can teach theory, we can teach protocols, we can help students to get to grips with what they're doing, but it's not an all-encompassing experience that is going to in any way replace a real lab. So there are limitations, and we have to be very aware of that ourselves when we create this content.